This is a true team effort from here at the Locke Foundation. Bill Gilbert, who had the original idea that we should do something like this, Greg DeDoug, and John McDuffie made it look as good as it does. Becky Gray made it understandable. If there's anything that doesn't look good or isn't understandable, that's my fault. And that's why you have the questionnaire sheet in front of you, to make comments on things as we go through. Because our goal is that for some of these pages, we want them to be standalone, like the FastFact cards that you have in front of you as well. So any comments that you have, any questions along the way, please feel free to make those or write them down on the sheets in front of you, and we'll be happy to address those as we're going through, and then make the improvements when we are back in front of the screens. So we're going to go through this, and we're going to break the budget down in about 4 different areas. One is just an overview of everything that is spent and is appropriated and where the money comes from. Go through another section where we focus a lot on the appropriations by area, talk about some more about where the money comes from in the different ways that we raise it, and then take a look at what we could be doing and where the future, what we can expect in the future with the budget. So starting with, when we talk about the budget in general, we talk about the general fund, which is the main source of taxpayer money. And the biggest portions of that are the individual income tax, about $12 billion, and the sales and use tax, about $7.5 billion. Between the two of those, that's 80% of the state's tax money that it earns and uses for most operations. Then of that money, $13 billion goes to education, another $5 billion goes to health and human services, and the rest of it gets split among justice, public safety, natural economic resources, general government, and capital, debt service, and other reserves. So some of the money gets set aside. Most of it gets spent. In addition to the general fund, we have transportation funds, which is the highway fund, the highway trust fund. And you can see how that breaks down. $2 billion of that comes from the motor fuel tax. $1 billion comes in federal money. So we have about $4.8 billion that goes to roads and other forms of transportation. And then here you can see that the biggest portion of that is for construction, some for maintenance. Public transit is about $130 million. Other modes of transportation, which includes rail, ferry, airports, things like that, that's another $200 million. So this is what the transportation budget looks like. Then one thing that we've taken a look at the budget over the years is comparing appropriations as they actually are to what they could be if we kept spending contained to the level of population and inflation growth. And you can see that from 1975 to about 1985, we just went back about 40 years in taking a look at this. But the first decade that we took a look at, spending was roughly in line with population and inflation. And you can see that if that continued, the budget today would be about $15 billion. Things started to go in the mid-'80s, then spending started to grow faster than population and inflation. And you can see that here with the 1986 line. 1996, there was a change in how the budget is calculated, so we take another break and start again in 1997. And you can see that spending was, again, faster than population and inflation. Then we get to here. In 2011, after the economic recession and the Republican takeover in the legislature, with Governor Perdue still in office, revenues, the budget started to go more in line with population and inflation, and that's where we are today. The legislature, to their credit, has been able to keep spending in line with population and inflation growth. That's something that we consider to be a good thing. So thank you all for the work on that, to our current and former legislators who have made that possible. Taking a look at it a different way, so that last slide, you had to kind of draw those lines out to say, what does this mean? This one we take a look at per capita spending adjusted for inflation. So if you want to see how we compare in spending to 1995, you just draw a straight line across, and that gets you a sense of where we are. And you can see how spending grew, kind of plateaued during the 2000s despite everything, because we were tapped out on what the state could earn, what the state could take in terms of taxes. And then since 2011, you can see that the line is again relatively flat. But general fund and transportation fund, the money that the state collects through taxes is only part of the story. You can see that federal money that comes into the state is about $15 billion, and then other funds, which include mostly tuition, but also lottery money, money from unemployment, and a number of other sources, that's about $11 billion. So that, when you bring those into account, general fund, transportation fund, state-earned money is a little over half of what the state actually spends. And these numbers all come from the Office of State Budget and Management taking a look at the current budget year. Once you add those federal and other sources of revenue in, education is now the second largest thing. Health and Human Services is the largest. And that's because we get about $14 billion of federal and other funds, mostly for Medicaid. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But this is where the money goes now of all the sources of funds that we have. And taking a look at it instead of by agency, by purpose, aid and public assistance, which makes sense given how much money is for education and how much money is for health care. $31 billion is for aid and public assistance. $7 billion is state employees, their pay, their benefits, things like that. $2 billion is money that gets spent within government on services. $2 billion is money that the government spends outside on services, so temporary employees, contracts. And then spend another $1 billion on stuff, actual capital, goods, supplies, all of the physical things that the state uses. So we took a look at the per capita spending for the general fund and transportation. This one we add in all of those other funds, and you can see how much growth there's been. That for the longest time, the state funds were the largest portion of what we spent, and in recent years that has come down. And while we've been able to maintain spending at a certain level with just the state tax dollars, once you include everything else, state spending has actually been increasing, even over the last 5 to 7 years. Taking a look at it as share of income, which is a way that folks in other sides of the argument about the state budget take a look at it. You can see that state spending has gone down a little bit as a share of personal income. When it comes to our own money, when you add in the federal funds, it's now up to about 13% in the other sources of funds. So state government as a whole has continued to grow, even as a share of personal income. And some of that money, this is taking a look at all the different sources. So the general fund, as we've already talked about, the highway funds we've already talked about, the federal funds, you can see how when there's a recession, those dollars tend to go up. That the federal government tries to bail states out and spend more money, and it also has there's more spending on social services and trying to offset what happens to individuals and families. Then on the other income, the biggest change comes in 2005 when the lottery is introduced, and you can see how spending and revenue from that source combined with the other sources, it increases once that happens. So within the federal funds, we get not every federal dollar that comes into the state goes through the state budget. This is one of those things that when you start taking a look at it in greater detail, you start scratching your head. And Mark Trogdon at Fiscal Research and the folks at OSBM were extremely helpful to me as I was trying to square these circles, and they said, you can't, they're different things. And the Office of State Controller, every year working with the auditor, put together a single state audit of federal funds. That's what goes back to Washington about how we use the money that they sent down. And so breaking it down by where the money goes, $9 billion, I mentioned already, goes to Medicaid and children's health insurance. A little over $3 billion actually goes to food assistance. And that is what we consider food stamps or the SNAP program. It includes money for the Women, Infants, and Children program, which is a food supplement. And it also includes free and reduced breakfast and lunch through the schools. That's about $3 billion. Then you can see student financial aid is about $2 billion. And that's the biggest source of the discrepancy between the grants that we get from the federal government and what shows up in the budget, because most of that money actually shows up as just the tuition payments. Because when you get, it may flow through the university, but it goes to the student, and the money comes then back into the university as tuition and room and board payments and food payments from the student into the university. So it does not show up as federal money because it comes through the students. And then we have about 700 other programs show up in this $4 billion over here. The federal government sends the money to the state in a lot of different ways. Taking a look at it again by which agencies receive the money, $13.5 billion goes to Health and Human Services. Again, most of that is Medicaid, but all those other social service programs that we have get included in that. The universities and community colleges, $3.7 billion. Again, most of that is that student financial aid that we saw, public instruction, transportation, and then everybody else in state government. Then breaking that lottery down, this is from the lottery's annual reports, and you can just see how the money has grown over time, and K-12 schools receive about 83% of the funds from the lottery. It started off as being split, pre-kindergarten, universities, K-12, and now with the biggest portion of that being K-12, even more of that money now goes to K-12 than before. And on the left, you can see that we've been cutting back. The lottery has been paying more out in prizes. That's been a deliberate strategy to try to increase revenue. That has, and you can see that state money has increased as well, even as the money in payouts has increased. So that's the general overview. Now we're going to take a look at the appropriations. And all this comes from a tool that the Office of State Budget and Management made available called Open Budget. And it breaks spending down in a number of different ways. Historically, they worked with some students at NC State to be able to put this together using SAS technology. So this is all kind of all-inclusive within North Carolina. And you can start to see the patterns that we saw in earlier, as I talked about. Education, mostly state dollars. Once you include everything else, second largest. Health and Human Services, second largest portion of state funding. Once you include all the federal and other sources of income, that's now by far the largest portion of spending in state government. And we'll take a look at it within each area. So education, K-12, again, single largest source of spending by the state, with some federal dollars thrown in for the programs that we talked about, the free and reduced lunches and some of the special education. University system, very heavily reliant on federal grants and federal student aid, and community colleges also get some student aid as well. Looking within the university system, you can see how that breaks down, and the receipts that come from grants and from financial aid heavily concentrated in what we could think of as our flagship schools, NC State, Chapel Hill, East Carolina and UNC Charlotte also do well with the outside sources of revenue. When you get to the smaller schools, Elizabeth City State, obviously the School of Science and Math doesn't have any federal financial aid because that's a state-funded free school for high school age students. But Elizabeth City State School of the Arts, Asheville, Fayetteville State, Pembroke, Winston-Salem State, none of those has a budget over $100 million. And most of that is state funds. So very little tuition. Some of those schools, when you add in Western Carolina and the $500 tuition that will be charged, you can expect that what we see of the red bars is actually going to shrink even further, and more state money is going to go into those institutions. But the biggest thing is that where the money goes and how disproportionate it is, for obvious reasons, but just what you can see with this, seeing it graphically sometimes helps me out in putting the picture to what's happening. Then taking a look at health and human services. Mentioned already how much that is dependent on federal funds, social services, mental health, public health, child development and early education, which includes most of the pre-K programs. All of that is very heavily reliant on federal funds. And the troubling thing about it is that these are programs that the state really has a lot more incentive to get right than the federal government. And we want to make sure that we're taking care of our people the best way. This is where the most vulnerable are, where you want to make the most reforms. It's one of the greatest frustrations that I had in the NC GEAR program is that you take a look at what we do and where the needs are, and you want to fix it. And yet, because so much federal money comes in, it makes it almost impossible for the state to do anything without putting those funds at risk in a way that makes sense for North Carolina. And then you add Medicaid on top of that. And that just shows where all the money is in the human services, that it goes through Medicaid, and that most of that is federal funds. And so we're really in a bind. That's why whenever there's a change in Medicaid, there has to be an amendment in the state. There has to be a state plan amendment. There has to be waivers if we want to be really innovative. And for a long time, that looked like we were not going to get any kind of permission from Washington to be able to make change, because that change would have required that we expand Medicaid. And if you think this bar is big now, add on an expanded Medicaid population, expanded services, and you would see some real growth in that bar. So that's what we face on health and human services, is that these are federally funded programs largely, and that the state has very little leeway in how it can make changes. Looking at the rest of the state budget, public safety, that is, as one would expect, a largely state-funded operation. Some money comes in for highway patrol, other things, from the federal government. Then natural and economic resources, Department of Environmental Quality, as one would expect, still gets a fair amount of federal funds. Wildlife resources, that is actually, it's a red, well, for most of these things, the red bar is federal funds. For wildlife resources, that is licenses and commissions and things that user fees, as opposed to the general fund. For guns and for boats and for everything that you use in the wildlife. It's been a deliberate idea for the Wildlife Resource Commission to be largely self-funded. Then general government, here the red bars are more often, except for military and veterans affairs, which is almost entirely red. That one is largely federal, but the rest of them, when you see insurance and treasurer and revenue and information technology, a lot of this is money flowing within state government from other agencies to make sure that the services that state government provides itself are being provided from state government in an efficient way. Some of those, when you talk about IT, you can because it's funded through receipts and where one agency is paying another agency, there's potential to be able to outsource that and do that in a different way, or be able to have some competition for internal resources. That the internal provider is now in competition with an outside provider. It's much easier to do that when you're driven by receipts than when you're driven outside, when you're appropriated money. Sometimes though, like with the Department of Administration here, when they receive some money for rent from some of the agencies, it makes it that much harder to go outside to look at private facilities, because you're comparing what you spend on state facilities, which may or may not be the best, but it's what you already have the budget for. And if you go outside, then you have to get an even larger budget to be able to get the level of facilities that you might want. But overall, what you see here is general funds, and so these are largely all general funds, but some of them are going through other state agencies. Going back to taxes just for a second, because we're going to take a look more at how that spending happens, and how the revenues change over time, and how difficult it is to be able to predict that, and some of the implications of that. Just again, that 80% of the money comes from individual income tax and sales and use tax. 7% comes from between corporate income tax and the franchise tax, which are the largest sources of business taxes in the state. Because these are really fun to the budget geek. Over here we can see what these are showing is how revenue changes year to year in these four categories. Corporate income tax, the blue line; franchise tax, the yellow line; sales and use tax, the red line; and individual income tax, the green line. And in both cases, the gray line is the same, that it's personal income for the state. And so the change that happens in personal income, as you can see on the corporate side, on the business side, that gray line looks almost flat, because we're talking about a very large scale of changes from year to year in corporate income tax and in franchise tax. On the corporate income tax side, that's mostly a question of reporting from the corporations. That in a good year, they're going to be able to report income, and they're going to dump a lot of money into that. In a bad year, when you're already losing money, you're going to dump all your losses into those years, and that's kind of how businesses do that. And so you can see that in a bad year, 2001, income fell by almost 50%, corporate income tax income, and then economy rebounds, and plus some temporary taxes, and income more than doubles the following year. Franchise tax, similar type of thing, but much less variation from year to year. On the individual income side, kind of the same story as the corporate income side, that because we rely on capital gains, because in the past there's been a progressive income tax, the changes would magnify changes in personal income from year to year. And you can see that most dramatically in 2009. But the scale of the changes within personal income and sales tax are much, much less than on the business side, because even the largest decline is less than 15% on this side. It's a lot of money, because that's 50% of the budget, 15% of 50%, but it's not nearly as volatile as on the other side. The sales and use tax, we can see what happens when you increase the sales and use tax by a penny, which raises about $1 billion, and when you allow that temporary sales tax to be eliminated, to go away. That you gain $1 billion, you lose $1 billion, it shows up as spikes. But overall, the sales and use tax moves much more in common with the personal income that we have. And when it comes to because income is volatile in these areas, that is part of the reason why we need a savings reserve fund. Because if you're going to have some fluctuations like that, you want to have something in reserve to be able to smooth out the spending. Because those spending things, as with so much of it going to education and health and human services, it's not like you can stop spending one year to the next year. You want to be able to maintain some of that level of service. It gets even more complicated when you try to forecast it. And so these are some of the differences in the income that was earned, the income that the state received through taxes in a year versus what was forecast. And generally, we would like to see the numbers, we would like to see these lines above the gray bar here, which is just a zero line, that between fiscal research and the Office of State Budget and Management in their forecasting, they're very conservative, and the state is doing better every year than expected. We know that's not possible, especially because nobody can figure out when a recession is going to hit. And so you can see in 2009, bad year in terms of projections versus what was actually collected. But for the most part, the differences are less than 5% on the income and sales and use tax side. So that's a great thing to be able to have predictability from year to year. It's a great thing to be able to, and with the numbers being generally above what's forecast, that means that the forecasts are conservative, and because, no offense to the legislators in the room, legislatures tend to spend everything that they have available. We want a conservative forecast so that that doesn't get out of hand. And that's what we've seen on this side and on the corporate side as well. A lot of times the corporate income tax, when you see the blue line skying up like that, that's a great sign for the state. And again, the conservative budget. We don't necessarily, again, that's 40% up and down from year to year compared to what's forecast. And that's just a function of the corporate businesses have a lot more flexibility with how they report income than individuals do. Right? When you get your money from wages and your taxes are withheld on a regular basis, that's not going to be able to fluctuate. You're not going to be able to adjust that as much as a business where they're paying estimated taxes and they can figure out when they should be charging their clients. Then this is just the same thing on motor fuels, and you can see what happens that when there's a recession, highway use tax, which is basically the sales tax on cars, disappears. We sell a lot fewer cars, people buy a lot fewer cars, and so that's the biggest thing that you see here. Registrations, licenses, gas tax, all of that kind of fluctuates in a way that you would normally expect. Here you see that the lines do end up above, which is this is the year-to-year volatility, not the compared to forecast. But basically, all this means is that the spending on cars and on gas tends to go up from year to year. Now, this is where all of what we've just gone through comes in and becomes, and where we start to make decisions and where it becomes really important. So, y'all will have heard some stories about the $1 billion shortfall that we can expect in 5 years. And that is based on a perfectly reasonable way to forecast spending and revenues. And the spending is the red line, which is based on what we currently spend. If we were to spend the same thing and do the same things and not change anything about how we do them as a state, then spending would grow roughly 4 to 5% a year. And with the revenue collections that we have, without a tax cut, you can see that even without a tax cut, with that spending growth, we end up with deficits or shortfalls in 2021-22. So in 5 years, regardless of what happens with revenue regardless of what happens with revenue policy, based on the current revenue projections, you still end up with a shortfall over the course of the next 5 years. If once you add the tax cut, right, then you end up with this light gray bar, which is a larger gap between spending and revenue. The number that we normally point to in terms of how the state should spend is try to keep it tied to revenue, tied to population and inflation. That's the yellow line, and you can see that that starts to get a little ahead of revenue as well. But the legislature has been able over the last few years to be able to keep spending at roughly 2.5%. If they're able to do that going ahead, then you end up with some small gaps here, but over time, you still end up with positive. And you can cover these gaps because you're able to set aside some of the money that is surplus here, bring it forward to the next year. If you're able to continue surpluses and bring some of that money forward, that leaves you with the ability in the savings reserve to be able to meet some of those needs without having to raise taxes and without having to make significant adjustments in policy. It's just a question of, can you find the way to keep spending down through efficiency and through reforms at that 2.5% level that has been able to be achieved over the last 5 years.
So this
yes,
is static scoring and not dynamic or scoring,
right? Yes.
Static scoring.
Yes. Yeah. So this doesn't include any potential economic benefits from that, which at a state level are harder to work in. This does also not include the effects of the federal income tax reforms that happened, because this was put together on the revenue side. This was put together last June. And so the effects from the federal level probably aren't significant to begin with, but could be enough to make up that difference between the light gray bar and the green line. And it'll be something that we look forward to seeing what those effects are, but that's not included in this either. And the federal would also have a greater impact on the dynamic scoring as well. So with that, right? So now this is the part of the budget that I like to think of as the Dave Ramsey School of State Budgeting, right? You don't spend more than you earn. That's the first one. Now you set aside some money for savings. That's step 2 in Dave Ramsey, right? And over the last few years, the legislature's been able to do that a whole lot more than previously. For the longest time, it was a struggle just to get to the 5% after the first couple of years of savings that it was established. Then in 2007, there was recognition that 5% probably isn't enough, and we should save more like 8%. And so, but as soon as that was established, we had a downturn in the economy, and so instead of being able to save up to 8%, we start drawing down on that reserve. Since 2011, that savings reserve has been replenished. For the first time, we are above 8%, or should be this year, above 8%. And then the legislature, all but unanimously, only one person voted against increasing the savings reserve and setting aside more money in it. Governor Cooper signed the bill. This was one of those things that there was very little disagreement on. And fiscal research and the Office of State Budget and Management came together and said, based on the law, taking a look back at all the recessions over previous years, 90% of the time, if we want to maintain fiscal health, how much do we have to have in reserve to be able to meet that? And the number that they came up with is 11.3%, which translates to about $2.6 billion. In the past, we've talked about setting aside 15% based on even more rigorous standards for how much should be in reserve. But 11.3%, you can see, is still above where we are, and something that the legislature and the governor can work towards is making sure that money gets set aside into these. It's great to be at 8%. It'd be better if we can be higher. And 11.3% is the objective, to be safe 90% of the time. So the next part, after you've set aside money for savings, then you start investing it and start taking care of what you already have. And this is taking a look at what we spend on repairs and renovations and debt service. So the debt service is the blue bar. This is what the state owes on money that's already been borrowed. The yellow bars are money that was set aside in the repair and renovation reserve, which was for making any repairs, as the name suggests, any repairs, renovations, improvements to existing facilities would be paid out of that. despite the money that's gone into it, you can see some of those years, a lot of money's gone into it. Some of the years, not much. There's a significant backlog in terms of where the buildings are and what should be set aside and the kind of improvements that need to be made compared to how much has been done. And so there's about a $4 billion lag there. Legislature in the budget created a capital and infrastructure reserve, which says that a portion of taking a look at the debt reserve, the debt service that's already being paid out, going up to what the debt capacity is. And debt capacity is defined, the current target right now is about 4% of general fund. So if we were to set aside the difference between what's actually going out to pay debt and that 4% level, that would be these red bars, and that will go into the repair and renovation reserve. Disappears, it goes into this capital and infrastructure reserve, which pays for repairs, renovations, and new capital projects. The goal of the bill is to stop incurring debt. That's a long-term goal, I'm thinking, not a short-term goal, but the more that can be paid out of current funds, the less need there is to bring on new debt. And as you can see, after spiking in the late 90s and through the mid 2000s, the level of debt that the state has been falling, and this is acknowledged debt, money that was borrowed in markets. Some of this was done through bonds. Before the Connect NC bond that was passed in 2016, in 2000 there was a bond that was passed for community colleges and universities. And you can see that spike. And then there was also some borrowing that was done using certificates of participation and some non-taxpayer approved debt. That practice largely stopped. And so we're fortunate for that. And there's a greater emphasis on making sure that voters get to approve new debt, new debt issues. Then once you have money set aside and you're paying down your debt, now you can start taking care of your people and start taking care of others. And that's a crucial thing because the biggest bar that you have here, this is state employee compensation. And the most recent year that Office of State Human Resources has available is 2015. And in 2015, the state employee's base salary, the average base salary was $44,000. That was a 6% increase, $3,000 from 2008 when there was $41,000. Other benefits increased by about the same amount because those are largely based on salary. It's how much, because the biggest portion of that is leave, vacation and holidays, things like that, plus death benefits, longevity pay. But you can see that these two move pretty congruously. The biggest jump that you see is in health and pension benefits. State is putting a lot more aside to pay the health benefits and the pension benefits for state employees. And on the health side, it's both current employees and future retirees. So that's current cost and future cost. It's gone from $7,000 to $12,000 in these 7 years. $5,000 difference. Not all of that money would likely end up in salary, but if you took all of that and put it into salary, that would be about, state employees would in 2015 have been earning close to $50,000. Instead, that money's been going to pay off the pension, been going to pay off current health benefits, and you see this in your own paychecks as well, and most personal income statistics, that because health insurance is so expensive and continues to grow each year, and employers provide the largest bulk of that spending, it means that salaries can't go up. And we see that here as well. The reason why not all of that money would end up in salary, part of that is that on that health benefit side, the state should be putting aside about $2,600 in 2016 to cover the future retiree health benefits. And is only putting aside about $870 that year. So there's a big gap between what's being set aside for the future to take care of retirees, to make sure that those health benefits that are promised and that the court said have to be paid, and what should actually be set aside to accommodate that on the healthcare side and on the pension side. On the pension side, we're actually meeting what the actuaries say the state should be spending, but that's based on some assumptions that may or may not be accurate, and you can see that most clearly in the current estimate versus what's considered the risk, which is based on about a 7.25% that year. The current assumed rate of return is 7.2%. And so if you set aside money and you expect to earn money and at a 7.2, 7.25%, you only need to set aside $8.8 billion now. It's weird saying only with billion, but it's what you do. Versus if you were to go down to a risk-free rate based on the Treasury bond, the state would have to set aside $56 billion. So realistically, we've got to be somewhere in between that, but it could be 6 to 7 times more money that needs to be set aside for pensions than is currently set aside. And so between those two things, in addition to the savings, this is the critical piece that for the state employees who are there, we've made promises to them. The state has made promises. Those promises need to be kept, not just out of moral obligation, but because the courts say so. And so more money needs to be set aside to accommodate that. Treasurer Falwell has spoken here in the last couple months and keeps making changes to both the health plan and the pension, and to make sure that these are more easily met and so that the liability comes down. But that's what the state has right now. And on this side, you can see that the returns for investments have not been meeting that threshold. So that is the state budget in all its depressing, colorful glory. If there are any questions on anything that we've gone through, or if you have comments on the way that we presented it, I look forward to hearing them in the couple minutes that we have left.